So years ago, I ran into a guy who had purchased a fairly new set of DW drums, and he proceeded to say that they were the worst garbage he'd ever heard in his life, and he didn't understand what all the hype was about with these drums. So at some point, I got a hold of the 8-inch tom-tom and gave it a thump, and it sounded like this. I'm not necessarily going to crack on somebody for wanting their drums to sound some low pitches. What I am going to take issue with is the sizes of the drums you're trying to get to do that job. See, I don't care how much you paid for any drum kit, boutique or otherwise. There are certain laws of physics that just cannot be overcome. And one of those is the larger the membrane, the lower its pitch. Now, we do have some flexibility with the range of tuning that we can get out of a drum, and I'm actually surprised that I was able to get these three little drums to sound as low as they do and not completely die on their ass. However, it's not ideal, and since I have a wide range of instruments to choose from, let's actually go through these and see which drum is better suited for the desired pitch. So if discretion is the better part of valor, then the better part of tom tuning is selection. Now you can say such and such celebrity drummer spent a whole bunch of money on this professional level kit, so I can get that same kit and get the same results. This to me is the drummer getting it backwards. They say a poor musician blames his instrument. Well, it's entirely possible that a poor musician also gives his instrument too much credit. Those professional drummers already have a pretty good idea of what kind of a sound they're looking for, and they'll pick the instruments that best suit that sound, whether it's from a professional grade set of drums or some quick gimme a set of drums that they found in a pawn shop. They come in there knowing that a 12-inch tom-tom is going to sound like a 12-inch tom-tom. Now if you look at my own setup, I always operate with the idea that I want generally a wider range of pitches, including something on the high side. So if my two main rack toms are 8 inches and 10 inches, it's not because they're easier to carry, it's because they tend to sound better with those higher tunings that I'm looking for. So I'm already bringing kind of an idea of the sound that I want to the party when I select those drums, and then I tune them from there. Now if you look at my Not DW kit, you'll see that the overall tonal range that I'm going for on there starts at 6 inches and ends in 18 inches in only 5 drums. It's not by accident. I mean, there's 5 tom-toms here, 8 through 16, and yet that doesn't give me quite the same broad range as that other setup, does it? We could get close, but those drums are optimized for the pitch range that I'm going for each one of those positions. And if I really have to trim one drum off of the kit, well, the 6-inch drum is usually the first one to go. It's nice to have, but it's not that terribly important. I can get by just fine going 8, 11, 14, 18. However, let's say I had to use somebody else's drum kit, and it came with a more pedestrian range of drum sizes and options. So I was maybe doing 10, 12, 14, and 16. Okay, I could work within that without messing with the guy's tunings, but my expectations are that those drums are going to sound like 10, 12, 14, and 16-inch drums. And I'm not going to down the kit because the tuning is not to my liking. I mean, if you buy a high-quality drum kit and you tune it in a way that's not ideal for that configuration of drums, the end result of that drum sound is not on the builder. That's on you. You made them sound that way when you tuned them like that. So let's go through how I like to tune my drums, and for this installment we'll focus just on the tom-toms. Alright, so we're starting with my 7 by 10 inch tom-tom here, and I've got this thing sitting pretty slack right now. I mean, that's low and papery and terrible. So what I like to do, I like to just go across in kind of the usual star pattern. And in this case, like I'm starting with the bottom head, and what I'm doing is I'm bringing that tension rod just to the point where I feel some resistance, and then give it like a quarter turn. And even with these DW style true pitch 30s, I've heard some drummers bemoan this true pitch system, saying it takes too long to get a drum up to tension. I tend not to have too much of an issue with it. Alright, so let's just... it's already sounding a little bit like a drum. Let's... Okay, so these sound a little low compared to the rest. And I noticed when I went to this key right here, I could feel it in my fingers that this had a little bit less tension on it than the ones around it. So that's why I kind of unofficially nicknamed myself the human torque wrench, which you should never give yourself a nickname because it won't stick. Just my own little joke to myself. And that's marginally better. But the idea is, as I'm trying to dial this thing up, I'm not just listening to the pitch around each tension rod. I'm actually feeling for how much resistance I'm getting at each point. So like right now, that's, if I did it just by feel, like these two actually feel a little tougher. So I'm gonna go ahead and dial these other 4 up. Give that a quick audio check. Okay, so those 2 are singing a little higher. And if I'm feeling more tension, say, on these 2 than on the rest of them, if I have to make an adjustment, like instead of adjusting this one, I went over to this one. So, pulled it across a little higher there. And then... okay. So then we'll work on the top head, which is sounding terrible. But I think I'm going to go with a half turn on these. And what I'm doing is I'm backing it off and then putting it till I just feel some resistance, and then count my turn from there. And this is just an attempt to sort of give myself a more or less neutral starting point. Okay, so bing, 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 bing. So let's get these 2 up a bit. Ooh. Hey. That sounds pretty righteous. Oh, I have a drumstick handy. I don't want to lay into it with a drumstick this close to my microphone, so we'll just use a Sharpie instead. Which is still plenty loud. Hope that's not clipping. So anyway, when it comes to tuning a tom-tom, that's how I approach it. I'm looking for medium to high tension around the head. I want it to keep a nice, even, clear sound. I usually don't like to tune the top and the bottom heads differently. Like, I'm not necessarily going for a pitch bend or anything like that. Especially with these drums doing double duty in the melodic kit, I want them to sound as clean and clear a note as possible. With snare drums, I'm going more for the sound that you would want from a snare drum in terms of the attack, the crunchiness, and things like that. So how I tune snare drums is maybe a bit different. And then bass drums depends on whether they're being used in the melodic setup, and I want nice, clean, clear tones just like the tom-toms, or if it's being used as a kick drum in more normal drum set playing, in which case I've got a different approach to it there. And so I feel like I might need to split those off into different categories and do different videos on those. So anyway, that's my approach to tuning tom-toms. And I said I wasn't going to knock somebody for the specific pitch range that they wanted on their drums. Now, assuming that the drummer from my story did have some idea of the pitches that he wanted to hear from his toms, let's see if we can put together a configuration that would better get him to those pitches while allowing the drums to sound good as well. Ordinarily, in a setup like this, I would suggest moving the drum sizes over by 1. So going to the next larger size up. So an 8 becomes a 10 becomes a 12, and a 12 becomes a 13. Not a 14. Look, the fact is 13 is still the next drum size up from a 12, whether anybody likes it or not. Back in the days, long before drums were pre-configured in strictly even-numbered drum sizes, the average setup was 12, 13, 16 if you had 2 rack toms in your kit. If you had 8s or 10s, you usually had to buy those as add-ons, extras, or maybe you got lucky and inherited an old Octa Plus kit or something like that from your uncles. But looking at the tuning ranges of these drums, I already know for a fact that they're at least 2 sizes too low in their tunings. So this 8 here, that thing really ought to be a 12. This 10 should be a 13. Oh, and listen to how papery that is. And then this 12 is actually tuned a shade lower than my 16-inch floor tom. So this should at least be a 14. I think the 16's actually clocking in a semitone higher than that thing. Now granted, I had to estimate from an estimation that I made based on the sound of one tom-tom almost 30 years ago. So in order to go to the extremes with this demonstration, because that reflects the extremes I was hearing in that moment, I basically got all these drums to finger tight and then put the key on the tuning rods just until I started to feel a little resistance. So these things are tuned as low as they'll go while still being able to sound a note. Alright, so now that we've decided on the sizes of the drums, let's go ahead and adjust the tuning accordingly, not getting exactly on these pitches, but getting into that general range and seeing if we get a better sound. Alright, so you can see how I've changed the setup. Now, instead of going 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, which is how these kits tend to come configured, now I've gone 12, 13, 14, 16, 18. For simplicity's sake, I've left the 20-inch bass drum in there, but really with a tom setup this big, I would probably go with a 24-inch bass drum as a minimum. Now the downside is, these drums are larger, they're going to be a little bit more expensive, it's not as easy to transport. But if you're looking for a really big, boomy, lower pitch drum sound, then you have to get big, boomy, lower pitch drums. It's kind of a joke that I have a bass drum that's only 14 inches in diameter. In very few circumstances does that thing actually qualify as a bass drum, which is probably why we call them kick drums, because of the role that they fill, not necessarily the pitch that they're reaching. So the tensioning on these drums is about middle of the road to maybe a little bit lower than that. So there's certainly room to bring these all up in terms of their overall tuning range or pitch range, and doubtless you'd get a tighter, punchier, clearer sound, maybe not so muddy as having all of these drums kind of booming across each other. Or if you insisted on having those specific pitches, then I would suggest going one drum up further still, starting with a 13 up top, put a 14 here, and then maybe do 15, 16, 18, or possibly even 16, 18, 20. The point is, if you're going for really low bass notes on all your tom-toms, you're practically going to have small bass drums mounted in those areas. Attempting to get there with 8, 10, 12, 14, probably not the best way to go, and certainly not the manufacturer's fault if they don't manage to sound like bass drums. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts on tuning tom-toms. I'm Mike Lindsay. Thanks for coming out. So these things are tuned as low as they will go, while still be abling. These are tuned as low as they can go while still be abling to sound the note. Which I've heard some drummers complain about them, like, oh, it takes too long to change a drum head. What the f*** are you doing, cat? How about not digging in the trash? How about that? Will that work for you?